Hi everybody, it's Tuesday, June 2. A lot of things are going on in the world right now, a lot of things in the news. I know that this church, this local church that I'm a part of, that hosts this YouTube channel, is in Canada. I myself am from the United States, so I've been seeing a lot of the news from the US, a lot of the turmoil, and it's been pretty wild, and I'm sure that you are not missing out on all of that as well. I'm sure you've seen some of that in the news too. I remember last month, I think it was last month, I watched through the 10-part Ken Burns PBS special on the Vietnam War. And it was amazing to see the protests and the riots and the upheaval in the United States during the late 60s, early 70s. And my wife and I commented that, doesn't that give some sort of context to all the political nonsense and everything going on in the US right now? You don't see right now what you saw in the late 60s, early 70s as far as cultural revolution and upheaval in the United States. How quickly things change. We see demonstrations now, not only in the United States, but also across the world, sparked in large part by, well, there's been obviously a whole line of incidents, but the one most recently, and there could be another one today or next week, who knows, but most recently is the video of George Floyd's death as the life was choked out of him under the knee of a police officer in Minnesota, which is just absolutely unbelievable to see and to comprehend. It's hard to know what to say for a devotion video, a midweek video, at a time like this, but I feel like this is a time that the church needs to be prophetic and Christians need to be prophetic. Whatever our context is, whether we live in cities, whether we live in the United States, this is about our shared humanity holding the image of God and being a witness to that publicly, to speak up for that, to say that all humans are created in the image of God and have dignity and worth on account of that. And I want to raise the point that God is for the oppressed. This is a strong biblical theme. We can go back almost to the beginning of the Bible, to the, let's just take the establishment of God's people Israel, who are of course raised out of slavery, that God is for the oppressed. And that if you look at the rules and regulations that God gives to his people, there's a strong theme of provisions for the oppressed. So for example, the people are told not to plow or harvest to the very edge of their fields, but to leave the corners, leave the edges for the people who are marginalized in their community. So there are provisions for the oppressed within God's regulations for his people, because God is for the oppressed. And when the kingdom of Israel rises to power and starts to fail in following God well, the things that the prophets point to again and again is their failure in caring for and treating the oppressed well, right? I mean, you can take a paradigmatic verse like Micah 6 verse 8, which says, here's what God requires of you, to act justly and to love mercy. And so the prophets are irate at the people for turning from God, and the sort of the tangible horizontal evidence that they've lost this vertical connection with following God. The horizontal evidence is that people are being oppressed, people are being mistreated. The prophets say, you sell the poor for a pair of sandals. Human life is not being valued. And that is what has the prophets so up in arms. That's what has God speaking these messages of truth to power through these prophets, standing up against the injustice, against the oppressed. And then we can move to the New Testament and see which people Jesus shows special concern for in his ministry. And it's people who are marginalized from the power center of the political and religious world at his time, right? Jesus is in a special way concerned with the widow, the orphan, children, poor people, and people who are Samaritans, the marginalized people, right? Jesus is concerned for the people who are hungry, thirsty, who need clothes, who are lonely, who are outsiders. Jesus says in Matthew, whatever you do for the least of these, you do to me. So not only is God for the oppressed, but here actually God, in the voice of Jesus, identifies with the oppressed. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. If you're interested in finding God, the place to find him is not in the power centers or in the most religious places. The place to find him is, according to Jesus in Matthew, with the oppressed. So those are two biblical realities that I want to highlight for us today. That God is for the oppressed, and that in the voice of Jesus Christ, God identifies with the oppressed. These should be challenges for us in our outlook, in our thinking, in our behavior. Whoever we come in contact with. All of us live in different communities, but we have a responsibility in how we live, where we live, and how we treat other people, how we raise our children, how we behave, how we speak, and even how we think, what we harbor in our hearts. There's just a couple places I want to go before I switch off the camera. One is to read a little bit from this book here, which is called Our Faith, which contains the belief statements, the creeds, confessions, testimonies of the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church in North America. Listen closely to these words. It says, "We believe that the Church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need, which implies, among other things, that the Church must witness against and strive against any form of injustice, so that injustice may roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream," right out of the Old Testament prophet Amos there. We believe that the Church, as the possession of God, must stand where the Lord stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged. That in following Christ, the Church must witness against all the powerful and privileged who selfishly seek their own interests and thus control and harm others. Therefore, it says, we reject any ideology which would legitimate forms of injustice and any doctrine which is unwilling to resist such an ideology in the name of the gospel. There is a lot to unpack there in those words. And I want to finish off by reading a few verses from the book of Revelation, chapter 5. This is John's vision of the throne room around God and what he sees. He sees these figures around Christ, and it says, each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls of incense, which are the prayers of God's people. Now that image itself is powerful, that there are golden bowls of incense, as John sees or comprehends them, that are the prayers of God's people. We need to be raising those prayers. Holding the golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of God's people, and they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy," singing to Jesus, "you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom of priests." That's the vision around God's throne room, that Christ has purchased for God people from every tribe and language and people and nation. We should be challenged by what we see in the news, and we should convert these challenges to our prayer life and our behavior and our speech. I think it's time for the church to have a prophetic voice in this context, even, maybe most of all, where the church is comfortable.